Up front with me now is James Clapper, former director of national intelligence under President Obama, also retired lieutenant general in the U.S. Air Force, and Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group. Gentlemen, it's good to see you this evening. Director, Biden saying tonight that Ukraine doesn't need F-16s right now, but Zelensky, even today, was calling again on the West to provide them. Who's right?
Well, I think actually President Zelensky is, to be honest. I think the administration is losing an opportunity here to exert leverage by simply announcing that we're going to enter Ukrainian pilots into training and their maintainers to support the maintenance requirements of F-16 and then reserve judgment on when and where to deploy them later. The problem is these weapon systems get more complex. They require more lead time to train the Ukrainians, set up the supply and logistics. So I think it would be show support for the Ukrainians and convey a message to the Russians if we simply announced that we're going to start a training program for the Ukrainians on the F-16. Because ultimately, maybe they don't need it today, but they're gonna at some point, because that's, air defense is a requirement for the Ukrainians, and the F-16 is a capable air-to-ground attacker. So I would respectfully suggest the administration consider announcing that and then reserve judgment on the actual deployment for later.
It's an interesting point, Director, that even the announcement, even though, as we've seen with all of the other announcements, and then how the actual delivery comes months later for some of these more complex systems, the announcement itself can work as a deterrent and send a strong message. Ian, just broadly, as we're sitting here on 365 days into this, where do you see this war standing 1 year in?
Well, for the last year, the level of support that the United States and the allies have provided to the Ukrainians has been extraordinary. It's been staggering, really, well beyond what anyone would have expected, including the Ukrainians in the early days, as well as the coordination in punishing the Russians. The big question is, can that persist? Certainly, you are starting to see a reduction of support among some Republicans and certainly among public opinion of those that tend to vote Republican, as well as among independents. And the Europeans are watching that carefully. They're deeply concerned about it. When I was in Munich at the security conference last week, speaking to a lot of Ukrainian officials, they don't like this formulation of the Americans saying, as long as it takes, because they feel like time is not working in their favor. They need as much as possible, as soon as possible, because if they're still fighting in 2, 3, 4 years' time on their ground, their economy is going to be completely destroyed. They're concerned about that. The final point is that China, of course, is now playing a greater role. And the fact that they've put forward this 12-point diplomacy plan is not going to be accepted by the Ukrainians or the Americans, but it is going to be accepted by all the developing countries in the world. In fact, if you didn't know that China had written this plan, could have easily come from India or from Brazil or South Africa. That's a problem for the United States. It's a problem going forward in terms of how this conflict plays out.
That's interesting. Director, speaking of China, from an intelligence perspective, what do you think of this new reporting that U.S. intel suggests that China is considering sending drones and ammunition to Russia? Having American intelligence even put this out there does what?
Well, I think it helps to, it's a good use of intelligence to exert some pressure on the Chinese, hopefully leaning on them not to do this, not to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. Now, whether they will or not, that remains to be seen. But I think this continues the pattern of operationalizing the use of intelligence either to pursue a military objective or, in this case, a diplomatic one, by diming out the Chinese in advance and hopefully putting some pressure on them not to provide weaponry of any sort to the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Ian, when it comes, if China isn't deterred, if they do decide to go ahead and provide the drones and the ammunition, what do you think the United States and its allies should do if China crosses a line here? Do you think the West should be drawing a red line on it?
Okay, I think one of the interesting things over the course of this war is that the Chinese, for all of their support of Russia diplomatically, they really have been on the sidelines. In fact, actual Chinese policy towards Russia has been virtually identical to that of India, which is, of course, much more aligned with the United States. If they were to provide direct military support for Russia, that is a red line. And that's why it's so important that not just the Americans, but also the UK Prime Minister, the NATO Secretary General, they all coordinated in making these very strong statements over the last few days that there will be hell to pay if the Chinese actually decide they're going to put their thumb on the scale in that way in favor of the Russians. I think you would see direct sanctions, secondary sanctions from the United States against Chinese firms. And while the Europeans would have to debate this very strongly because, you know, their economies are already getting hit a lot harder because of this Russia war, I suspect that most of them, especially the Germans and the French, would be aligned with the United States. This is the exact opposite of what the Chinese wants to see happen going forward. So I agree with Jim. It was a good use for operational intelligence. And I personally would be quite surprised if the Chinese went ahead and actually did provide these weapons in the near future.